Hi, folks. This is Father-Offspring Interviews, episode 14, and we are jumping right in. Are you ready?
Dude, let's do it. I decided I needed to be a little more animated with these things.
All right. First, Arthur from Ohio says, if I understand what you've said in the past, when someone does the right thing without really thinking about doing it, there's not a lot of activation in the PFC. Is engaging this process automatically similar to the automaticity that occurs in complex motor learning, where procedure memory is activated in the cerebellum? Would this easiness start in the PFC and then be transferred to the cerebellum as overlearning?
Well, like any good professor, my answer is yes and no. What you're referring to is what I think of as like an incredibly important study that was carried out by Josh Green and colleagues at Harvard. I love this study. Circumstance where he was brain imaging people and they were playing some sort of game where they had an incentive to get their answers right. And it was set up with a very clever design where at various points, the person in the scanner playing it was under the impression that they could cheat and get away with it. And you could tell when that was happening. And he looked at people who did indeed cheat. He was able to detect it. Again, part of the really clever design. And these were not people who cheated at every one of these possibilities, but they did at least some of the time. And what he observed was massive activation of the prefrontal cortex during that time. Should I do it? Should I not do it? Why not? All of that. But then there were the people who never once cheated. And the question became wonderfully framed by Green in the title of this paper: is one seeing will or grace? Is one seeing a vast amount of willpower? Are you seeing people resist because their frontal cortex is just wrestling Beelzebub down into the mud? Or is it a state of grace? It's just easy. It's just you don't do it. It's not the harder thing to do because it's not the harder thing to do. And his answer was emphatically that, yeah, you didn't get activation of the PFC. So, how did that happen? Where is the activation then? Was it ever in the PFC? Exactly the question brought up. What happens with automaticity? And we know in some realms, pretty straightforwardly, you're learning to play a piece on the piano and there's some really tough trill, and every time you're playing it, like 2 measures beforehand, you're already thinking, here it comes, tuck in my elbow, lead with my thumb, whatever it is. And then there's the day that you are playing it and you suddenly realize you're like 4 measures past the trill. You played it without having to think about it consciously. It's the first time that metaphorically, your hands knew it better than your head did. The first time it stopped being a prefrontal sort of cognitive, aware, explicit task to running automatically. And the best evidence is that that's going on in the cerebellum, among a few other places, basal ganglia probably also. So that's what's going on when suddenly you don't have to think about how to do a good tennis backhand anymore. You don't have to think about how you walk down a flight of stairs without falling. And what you see is that when you take those automatic, implicit motoric pathways by then and force it back into explicit, declarative, conscious, you suddenly can't do a backhand because you're thinking about it too much and you trip down the stairs. So this automaticity. You could see the automaticity on sort of a higher scale. You get somebody who is a retired professor of architectural history and they've got a dementia problem and they may have extreme disorientation as to time and place and all of that, but they could still give you a totally like charming, opinionated, cranky 10-minute lecture on the history of flying buttresses and then do it all over again right after that if they're given the cue again. So, whoa, that could be doing a lecture on flying buttresses. That's cerebellar. I don't know, maybe not quite as much. And that brings us now to the realm of like, ooh, do I resist temptation? Can I have my prefrontal cortex work hard enough that I can resist and I'll do the right thing, even though this is the harder thing to do? And what the suggestion is from the studies is long ago that got transferred out of the prefrontal cortex. It's not a challenge because you just don't do that. That's not who I am. I don't cheat. And it's not hard. It's simple. And that speaks to all sorts of these studies, just to sort of cast that writ very large. You look at people who do amazing heroic stuff, hiding refugees from the Nazis, things like that. And Carnegie Foundation has actually done these studies trying to see what was up with those people who did that. And they didn't necessarily have a history of great heroic acts in the past. And it wasn't that they were atypically religious or atypically irreligious, or all sorts of predictors like that didn't come through. What was it? They were very average people who simply had been brought up in an atmosphere where it was inculcated into their head 24/7 that that's not what you do. You do the right thing at that juncture and become automatic. If that's cerebellar, I'd be mighty surprised, but we've been surprised already by some of the automaticity of the cerebellum. But it's something that is sure not a frontal cortical task anymore. It is people who have worked so hard and thought through it and felt through it that doing the right thing is not the harder thing to do.
Okay, next, DJ from Minnesota says, how does the ketamine treatment differ from MDMA, psilocybin, etc.? I experienced ketamine in a medical environment and it resulted in a significant improvement in my mental well-being. So just wondering how ketamine compares to these other mind-altering substances.
Whoa, very trendy question. In the realms in which it is most likely that both of them would be applied, or one would consider applying either of them, is in the realm as an antidepressant. For decades and decades, all of the antidepressant meds were targeting the serotonin system, or the dopamine, or the norepinephrine system, with some success, but tragically limited nonetheless. And over the last decade or so, emerged what counts as the first new class of antidepressants that have a very, very different mechanism of action. And this was ketamine, approved in 2019. Ketamine having a characteristic that really distinguishes it from the other antidepressants, which take days to weeks to work, and ketamine goes in there and breaks the back of that depression within hours, which is remarkable and very unique. Meanwhile, way out in the boondocks is an emerging story that things like psilocybin could have some antidepressant effects as well. And that field is not as far along, in part because a huge stigma to overcome and regulatory stuff, but it's appearing as if there are some rapid acting antidepressant effects there as well. Also some effects against things like post-traumatic stress disorder and such. So the question is, are they working through similar mechanisms? And the best evidence at this point is completely different ones. Ketamine, what ketamine does, it's called an NMDA receptor antagonist. There's a neurotransmitter called glutamate that nobody used to think about with depression. Except it turns out ketamine is good at blocking one of the types of receptors for glutamate, something called the NMDA receptor. It blocks it, and it has rapid antidepressant effects. And this turned out to probably explain a piece of this whole puzzle of sort of the neuroanatomy of depression. So this brings us to a part of the brain which I learned about and memorized for a final exam once and then didn't think about for decades afterward. This obscure region called the lateral habenula, which is kind of cool to pronounce, but that's about it. And nobody ever knew what it did until people started noting that it appears to be overactive in depression. And as a result of its overactivity, it is sending an inhibitory signal to the dopamine reward anticipation system. Ooh, what are we beginning to define here? A pathway towards anhedonia, the inability to feel pleasure or anticipation in depression, seem to have something to do with overactivity of the lateral habenula, which appeared to have something to do with overactivity of glutamate working as an excitatory neurotransmitter in the lateral habenula, stimulating GABA releasing inhibitory neurons. And you go in there and you throw in ketamine, which blocks those receptors, and glutamate can't drive the lateral habenula into being hyperactive anymore. That's the current closest thing to what's going on in there. Meanwhile, with the likes of psilocybin, they're working completely differently. Psilocybin, mescaline, LSD, all sorts of them are instead working on the serotonin system. They bind to serotonin receptors, a certain subtype, the 2A serotonin receptor subtype, and activate them. And somehow that's getting you from activating these, and this is not fitting into the standard model of what's the main problem with depression, too little serotonin, let's give them an SSRI and boost it up. This seems to be a more specialized effect than that. And at that point, people are totally confused because nobody knows, and it looks as if you're stimulating the serotonin receptor long enough, its sensitivity gets regulated down, and as a result, the dopamine system or maybe the glutamate system compensatorily upregulates her. And nobody knows at this point, but it's through a very, very different pathway. It's super exciting. Nobody knows quite how it works. That's as far as it's gotten. It stimulates one subtype of serotonin receptor. In terms of efficacy, what's now been shown, there was a nice paper in New England Journal of Medicine last year, a year before, that was comparing using psilocybin as an antidepressant with a classic SSRI, Lexapro, and what they showed was very different mechanisms of action, different time courses, but roughly equally effective. So that's a very exciting new domain of pharmacotherapy.
Our next question is, do you believe in astrology?
Yes, I do. I do. I believe all sorts of people shell out good money in the name of it. I believe the ancient Egyptians were into it maybe with their sun god Ra. I believe it's manifested itself in all sorts of different charmingly varied domains of gibberish. Yeah, okay. that's the extent to which I believe in astrology.
Finally, Yael from Israel asks, I would love to hear your thoughts on anti-Semitism, not only now, and the causes besides the us and them explanation. It seems more complex than hatred for any other them. Is it their success, especially in the Western society, or do you have other thoughts?
Well, that's a real minefield we're going to stumble into here, Yael. And so, is there anything unique about anti Semitism compared to all the other ways in which people are awful to outgroups all over the planet? And just to fall back on what was an easy answer before, my professorial answer is yes and no. Yes and no. In some ways, no different at all from certain types of outgroups. Susan Fiske, very renowned psychologist at Princeton, has done this wonderful work that all outgroups are not the same. We've got different categories of thems in our heads. There's some thems which we view as they're not very competent, but they're warm, they're loving. This is grandma, now that she's become demented. This is a baby. This is what does this evoke? Pity or protectiveness, or a sense that they used to be an us, or they're going to be an us, or if there hadn't been this damn mutation, they would be an us, that sort of thing. Then there's the category where you view them as neither competent, efficacious, or warm, benevolent. And homeless people, drug addicts, and she's done these amazing studies where, like, you flash up pictures of those folks and you get activation of parts of the brain related to disgust and distaste and get them away from me. But then there's the really interesting, complicated category that she identified, people who you view as highly competent and highly efficacious and highly able to achieve their goals, but not nice and not warm and not assimilating and not benevolent. And that's where we land with various outgroups over the years, because they don't evoke pity, they don't evoke disgust, they evoke envy and resentment and hatred. And these were the Jews of Europe. And that was brought about very easily by all sorts of laws that Jews couldn't own land, they couldn't be in government service. So they became the shopkeepers and the money lenders, and all of that. Was that unique? Not in the slightest. Go to East Africa, and while the Brits were running the place, they decided to bring in lots and lots of workers to build the railroads from South Asia. And suddenly you had Indo-Pakistanis who afterwards stayed on and weren't allowed to own land or serve in the government, and they became the shopkeepers and the bankers and the money lenders. And apparently you've got the same thing with Lebanese in West Africa, in Malaysia. Traditionally, when the Brits were running things there, you wouldn't want to have the local Malaysians start building your economy. So let's bring over some people from China and make them the middle class, make them the mercantile class by restricting what it is they were excluded from. And the same thing. And in all those cases, everybody hates them. Everybody views them as parasitic. Everybody views them as sucking the blood out of our national aspirations. Everyone views them as not only being thems, but thems who want to be thems. They don't assimilate. They don't want to fit in. They don't want to do that sort of thing. Here's your diagnostic test if you're dealing with one of this type of outgroup, which is you sit there and you say, damn, I hate those people and they're so cold and not really us, even though they're third generation by now. They're real, but damn, they know how to make money. And you know, if you're sick, you better go to one of their doctors because they make really good doctors. That's your sign. And there's a really interesting thing that's done when finally the people with the pitchforks and the brown shirts come for this outgroup. The first thing they do is they degrade them. They turn them from a them who's competent and more capable and efficacious amid being cold, and you turn them into ones that have none of that. You demean them, you break them, you shit on their sacred symbols, you make them brush the sidewalk with their toothbrushes in front of a mocking crowd. When Idi Amin booted the Hindis, the Indo-Pakistanis in Uganda out who would serve that role, he invited his military to come and beat them and mass rapes beforehand. That's what you do with that outgroup. Before you torture them, you degrade them first. And so in that regard, Jews are just like the South Asians of East Africa and the Lebanese of West Africa and various other groups in the Chinese and Malaysia, all of that. What's the big difference? Just the sheer antiquity of it. Like this one has been around like way longer. If you were like a Bantu farmer in East Africa whose ancestors developed the resentment of the shopkeepers who were all Indian, that's 150 years old at the most. Anti-Semitism is like the oldest one. I mean, people have been given the heebie-jeebies by Roma, and they wind up in the classic disgust category in terms of what they evoke. But Jews have been in this category way longer, and I am told what happened. I believe this is the most convincing story, that when Christianity first took sail, the first plan was this was going to be an amazing new route for young Jews to turn their backs on the sort of corpulent money lenders in the temple kind of thing and join new hip Judaism that we're going to call Christianity. And when they had none of it, they dropped part of the origin story, which was that it was Pontius Pilate who made the decision to do in Jesus, and instead decided, you know what, it's not going to work here. So let's try to sell it to the Romans. Let's try to make Jesus sound like this Apollo that all the young hip kids in Rome are really into these days. And Pontius Pilate isn't the one who did it. The Jews were the one who said, let's get Pontius Pilate said, I'll even let this guy go. And that was the sales technique. And somehow out of that came 2,000 years. And what you get out of that is by now a fairly unique thing, the ways in which this is different from the Indo-Pakistanis in East Africa, et cetera, which is if for 2,000 years Jews have been whatever it is that's good that the Christians are up to, they're the opposite, they can take on a lot of different forms. And you get what seems to be the impossible, that simultaneously you could be prejudiced against subgroups of Jews because they're rich capitalists who control the economy. And at the same time, you can be prejudiced against other ones because they're Bolshevik anarchists who are going to overthrow the government. And if you're really creative, you somehow decide those two extremes are one and the same. And then you're really going on 8 cylinders there, or whatever the cliche is. And so it's a very familiar version of prejudice, but simply because it is the oldest one around of extant ones that are really sort of relevant to everyday life, because it has just had centuries to fester and metastasize and go in all sorts of directions. So you can believe in two simultaneously contradictory things and feel righteous in your discrimination at that point. So that said, maybe minefields redux. It's probably worth noting that if you're a little bit distressed at a government dropping bombs and killing 17,000 children, or arming settlers who were blocking food convoys going into Gaza, if that gets you a little bit upset, I don't think that constitutes anti-Semitism. And anytime you see every protest on campuses, way in the front there inevitably are Jewish Voices for Peace as one of the leading organized groups, having problems with this version of Zionism sure as hell ain't anti-Semitism. They are two very different things. Just to really put my foot in it. But so that's what I think about anti-Semitism.
Yeah, let's say it's a pretty important distinction. And that is the end of episode 14. Keep submitting questions at the form found in the Instagram story highlight and bio or the YouTube video description. I'm Offspring Sapolsky, and thanks for your continued support of science and the beard.